Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Most people don't remember Monday, July 27th, 2020. For most, it started with lukewarm coffee and a sluggish commute. But in a quiet Philadelphia suburb, just off the low-slung rails of the Meadowbrook train station, a very different day was unfolding. A silver sedan sat idling in the far end of the commuter lot. Doors closed, engine running, no movement. A commuter passed by, then slowed. The car wasn't empty. Inside the vehicle, a purse on the passenger seat, a phone unlocked and untouched. But next to the car, on the pavement, a teenage girl was lying in a pool of blood, face down, motionless. When the 911 call came in just after 8:40 a.m., it was reported as a possible medical emergency. But the moment EMS arrived, it was clear this wasn't an accident or a rescue. The victim had sustained over 24 stab wounds to the torso and neck. Defensive wounds were either absent or obscured by the violence. No witnesses remained at the scene, no obvious signs of struggle beyond the blood pattern, no immediate suspect, and yet nothing had been taken, not the phone, not the wallet, not the vehicle. This wasn't a robbery. Investigators sealed off the Meadowbrook lot. Local news scrambled helicopters overhead. Crime scene techs snapped photos of the blood trail, mapped entry points for tire tread, began swabbing the driver's side door. The victim was young, likely under 20. Blonde hair, recent manicure, dressed in casual day wear. No ID on her person, but her phone was intact, and fingerprint scans confirmed it by noon. Morgan McAffrey. Age, 18. Resident of Abington Township. She had just graduated high school that June. The discovery shocked the community. A commuter station isn't where you expect to find a teenage homicide victim left behind with the engine running. But the most chilling element wasn't the scene itself. It was what police didn't find. There were no brake marks, no signs of a struggle away from the vehicle, no torn clothing, no signs of forced entry into or out of the car, and the victim's body. It was positioned with deliberate placement, almost ritualistic, parallel to the vehicle. Arms curled inward, not collapsed, placed. That alone changed the framing of the case. This wasn't random. This was targeted. And whoever did this knew the layout of the Meadowbrook Station. How to get in, and more importantly, how to get out. By midday, the press conference was underway. Police made a careful statement. The crime appeared isolated, but intentional. No one was in custody. No suspect was named. Back at headquarters, the digital forensics team began extracting data from Morgan's phone. It would reveal far more than any witness. Morgan had exchanged a series of texts early that morning, short messages, no more than a few words. The last outgoing message, "I'm here." Incoming messages from an unknown contact were wiped prior to arrival. That deletion raised red flags. Who deletes texts right before meeting someone, unless they're hiding the intent of that meeting? By day's end, two facts were clear. First, Morgan had voluntarily arrived at the train station that morning. She hadn't been abducted or lured. She was there to meet someone. Second, the killer had left no DNA at the scene, no weapon had been recovered, and no witnesses had seen anyone fleeing. Still, the car's dash camera had caught partial movement, just enough to warrant enhancement. That night, homicide detectives made their first official theory known. This was not a spontaneous act. This was planned. And as one officer quietly noted in his preliminary field report, there was too much precision, too little panic. Whoever did this, they came to finish something. The preliminary forensic report identified the victim as Morgan McAffrey, age 18. No aliases, no criminal history, no prior contacts with law enforcement. Her phone and social media activity in the 72 hours before her death showed no signs of threats, panic, or erratic behavior. What it did reveal, however, was a string of short, vague messages leading up to her arrival at Meadowbrook Station. The last outgoing text read, "I'm here." There was no response. The homicide unit requested background from the family to build a psychological profile. The objective wasn't just to humanize Morgan, it was to reconstruct motive, routine, and risk exposure. Morgan was raised in Abington Township, a mid-sized Pennsylvania suburb, roughly 30 minutes from Philadelphia. She had graduated from high school a month earlier and had recently been accepted into a nursing program. No employment history, no prior incidents at school or in her neighborhood. She lived with her mother and younger sister. The father was no longer in the household. No active restraining orders were on file. Detectives conducted the initial family interview less than 24 hours after the crime scene was secured. Her mother confirmed that Morgan had left home that morning shortly after 8 a.m. She told her mom she was meeting someone to talk things out. When asked who, the mother hesitated. She believed Morgan was meeting her former boyfriend but didn't have confirmation. That former boyfriend, unnamed at this point in the investigation, was reportedly someone Morgan had recently broken up with. The relationship lasted approximately a year, starting in her junior year of high school and ending less than a month prior to her death. What stood out during the interview wasn't a single red flag. It was a collection of quiet details. Morgan had become more private in the final weeks. She changed her phone passcode. She deleted entire message threads. She stopped sharing her location with family and friends, which had been a default behavior for her prior. When her sister asked about it, Morgan reportedly shrugged and said, "It's nothing." Her personal journal, recovered from her bedroom, added more context. One entry, dated July 15th, included the line, "I don't think he's handling it well, but maybe if I'm kind, he won't do anything stupid." This single sentence became a focal point in the psychological assessment. Investigators highlighted it not as evidence of an imminent threat, but as a reflection of Morgan's state of mind. She wasn't afraid for her life. She was managing someone else's reaction. Digital forensics uncovered that Morgan had been active on Instagram less than an hour before her death. She had opened a direct message thread with someone listed only as G. The entire conversation history had been wiped. Metadata confirmed the deletion occurred at 8:21 a.m., less than 20 minutes before her estimated time of death. This wasn't routine behavior. People don't delete full threads minutes before they're murdered, unless they're trying to erase evidence of what was planned, or trying to protect someone they believe still had something to lose. At this point in the case, investigators did not release the identity of the person referred to as G. But the trajectory of the forensic data was narrowing, and Morgan's phone, though clean on the surface, had already given law enforcement more than the killer realized. Meanwhile, friends interviewed by detectives provided one recurring theme. Morgan had always downplayed things. If something made her uncomfortable, she didn't dramatize it. She withdrew. She tried to rationalize it. She said he wasn't dangerous, one friend recalled. Just intense. The kind of guy who didn't like being ignored. When asked why she agreed to meet him, her friend didn't hesitate. She didn't want to make it worse. She thought if she talked it out, he'd let go. But the forensics told another story. Deletion patterns, timed messages, careful avoidance of names or places. It wasn't panic, it was strategy. Morgan was trying to keep things quiet, for herself or for him. And that silence turned fatal. The forensic team returned to Meadowbrook Station less than 12 hours after the initial crime scene sweep. The physical evidence had been collected, bagged, and logged, but what investigators needed now wasn't on the pavement, it was in the pixels. Every angle of that station was bordered by digital infrastructure, parking lot surveillance, signal timing, vehicle plate recognition at the north exit. Nothing about the area was technically blind, but visibility didn't guarantee clarity, especially not in a crime that happened in minutes. At 8:17 a.m., Morgan's silver sedan pulled into the far left parking slot, row D, camera number 06. She parked neatly, engine still running. No signs of hesitation or sudden braking. She did not exit the vehicle. At 8:19 a.m., footage from camera number 03 on the northwest pedestrian path recorded a person entering the lot on foot. The individual wore a dark hoodie with the hood up, a medical-style face mask, and carried a drawstring bag slung over the shoulder. Time of approach, 2 minutes and 36 seconds after Morgan's arrival. By 8:24 a.m., camera number 06, partially obstructed by an overgrown pine, captured a brief shadow moving near the driver's side of Morgan's vehicle. The shape obscured, only the partial silhouette of a leg and lower torso was visible. By 8:27 a.m., that shadow reappeared, briskly moving away from the vehicle, crossing frame number 08, the lot's northern camera, and exiting eastward on foot. Total elapsed time near the vehicle, under 3 minutes. At 8:32 a.m., a white SUV, possibly a late-model Jeep Cherokee, exited the lot through the north gate. The vehicle triggered the plate recognition system, but the rear plate was covered, intentionally blocked by a dark plastic flap or towel. Forward-facing dashcam footage from a SEPTA maintenance van passing on Route 611 captured the same vehicle turning eastbound, heading toward Philadelphia. The timeline from Morgan's arrival to the suspect's exit spanned 15 minutes. Forensic reconstruction analysts worked backward from the moment her body was discovered. Medical examiners estimated her time of death between 8:25 and 8:28 a.m., based on blood coagulation and core temperature. The lack of struggle and silent duration matched that estimate. One of the lead investigators noted in their case log, "No shouting, no witness reports, no sudden movement in adjacent lots. That's not panic, that's control." Investigators were particularly interested in the suspect's knowledge of camera blind spots. The individual never showed their full face or direct angle to any lens. Either this was a coincidence or someone knew where Meadowbrook Station's surveillance weaknesses were. Meanwhile, the partial plate data from the white SUV was processed through PennDOT records. Out of over 18,000 potential vehicles statewide matching the partial digits and color make, 4 vehicles stood out based on registration zip codes and prior connections to Morgan's known social circle. Of those, 1 matched the description: a white Jeep Cherokee registered to a household in Philadelphia. The owner was male, 18, a former high school classmate of Morgan's. But at this point in the investigation, no charges were filed, no warrant issued. The department needed physical confirmation, not just a partial tag and circumstantial association. They turned to Morgan's phone again. The digital forensics unit traced her location data using Google Location History. Her phone had recorded a steady path from Abington to Meadowbrook, pinging cleanly off the cell towers with no detours. But at 8:23 a.m., just 3 minutes before her estimated time of death, her device lost signal. Not powered off, no manual shutdown, simply lost connectivity. That placed her in what investigators called the blackout wedge, a known dead zone between 2 towers that had caused interference in previous case studies. It was an area just wide enough to let a device go dark temporarily, long enough to cover an attack, long enough to delay SOS signaling. When the device reconnected at 8:28 a.m., it was motionless. GPS static, location unchanged. At 8:37 a.m., EMS recorded time of arrival. This level of digital sequencing narrowed the viable time window to under 4 minutes. By now, the case was no longer categorized as unknown motive or open circumstance. It was targeted, fast, and premeditated. The suspect not only avoided camera exposure, but knew exactly how long to remain unseen and where to move without detection. A senior detective commented off record, "It wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. You don't come into a location like this with a face mask, hoodie, and bag unless you're planning something final." Back at headquarters, analysts reconstructed the movement path using a frame-by-frame composite. When viewed in sequence, the entrance, interaction, and exit formed a near-perfect triangle. It wasn't chaotic, it was calculated. What remained now was to match that triangle to someone. And the deeper question, how did a teenage girl get pulled into a trap this quiet, this efficient? 3 days after Morgan McAffrey was murdered, investigators had enough. Enough to act, not enough to arrest. But the sequence of surveillance, digital logs, and license plate reconstruction had begun to converge, not just on a theory, but on a physical address. The white Jeep Cherokee, captured on security footage exiting Meadowbrook Station just minutes after Morgan's estimated time of death, had triggered a partial plate match. That led them to a residence on a quiet block in northeast Philadelphia. The vehicle wasn't registered under Morgan's name, but the family at that address had a known link, a teenage male who had once dated Morgan. Public records showed he'd graduated from the same high school. His name had already been cross-referenced in her text history. No warrant had been issued yet. But what they had, surveillance evidence, timing, location, and proximity to the victim, was enough for a knock and talk. Detectives approached the house late in the afternoon. No sirens, no lights, just a quiet approach. When the door opened, the mother answered. She appeared cooperative, unsure why they were there. When detectives asked about the white Jeep, she confirmed her son drove it. Yes, it was home. Yes, he had been driving it earlier in the week. No, she didn't recall anything unusual. But then one of the officers noticed something subtle: the license plate. The rear plate was slightly bent at the top and loosely hanging by one screw. A dark cloth, later determined to be a mechanic's towel, was stuffed partially behind it, the exact kind of setup used to obstruct a plate from being read at an angle. That alone didn't prove guilt, but it confirmed intent to hide. And that, combined with what they already had, gave the department enough to request a search warrant. The warrant was signed by 8:13 p.m. Entry was executed at 9:06 p.m. Inside, the search was targeted. Investigators were looking for anything matching the following: a black hoodie, a face mask, a drawstring bag, and, most critically, any sharp weapon that could match the dimensions and depth profiles of the wounds on Morgan's body. In the laundry room, buried beneath 2 layers of clothes inside a hamper, they found a black hoodie. The sleeves were inside out. On the left cuff, small stains visible under blue light later tested positive for blood. The DNA profile matched Morgan's. In the kitchen, 2 knives were missing from a 5-slot block. A family member stated they were probably in the dishwasher, but they weren't. No knives found elsewhere in the house matched the type used in the attack: double-edged, fixed blade, 4 to 5 inches long. Inside the suspect's room, detectives located the drawstring bag. It was empty. But luminol tests later revealed small traces of blood residue on the inside fabric seam. Faint, but present. By 11:32 p.m., a second item had been logged: a pair of black athletic shoes with faded tread. These were recovered from under the bed. They matched the partial shoe print pattern recovered at the crime scene in the dirt beside Morgan's vehicle. Then came the digital forensics lead. The suspect's home Wi-Fi router kept connection logs. When cross-referenced with Morgan's deleted message thread, it showed that her phone had communicated with a Gmail account linked to that household's IP address as recently as 8:10 a.m., less than 10 minutes before she arrived at the Meadowbrook lot. It wasn't definitive, but in homicide cases few things are, until they're placed in context. The turning point came the next morning when a court-authorized extraction of the suspect's cell phone showed a recently deleted search: how long does DNA last on fabric? That query had been entered at 2:24 a.m., just 1 day after Morgan's body was discovered. It was time to escalate. The suspect was brought in for questioning under the pretext of providing voluntary clarification. He waived counsel. The initial conversation was calm. He denied seeing Morgan that week. Claimed to be driving around the morning of her death, couldn't recall where. When shown a still image of his Jeep from the dashcam footage, he didn't react. When asked why his phone data placed him within 500 feet of Meadowbrook Station between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m., he answered, "I might have passed it. I don't remember." But memory loss wasn't going to hold. Investigators didn't present the hoodie right away. They waited until DNA results came in. It was a match. That, combined with the deletion patterns on both phones, the physical evidence recovered, and the suspect's inconsistent timeline, was enough for the DA's office to proceed. The charge: murder in the first degree. It wasn't an arrest made under duress or pressure. It was a case built brick by brick, every layer verified before it was added. There were no shortcuts. But as the lead investigator noted in their report, the subject planned the exit route better than he planned the cleanup. There's a fine line between calculated and careless, and sometimes it only takes one drawer left unemptied or one digital footprint unerased to bring it all crashing down. In the early hours of July 27, 2020, forensic examiners at the Montgomery County Crime Lab concluded their initial analysis of the weapons found in Gilbert Newton III's possession. Both knives, one a 5-inch serrated blade and the other a 7-inch chef's knife, were stained with the victim's blood. The handle of the smaller knife retained partial fingerprints consistent with Newton's right hand. The larger blade had been wiped clean, but trace elements of DNA remained embedded at the base near the hilt, also matching Gilbert Newton. The crime lab's report confirmed what had already become apparent. The attack was not impulsive, nor did it arise from a sudden quarrel. It was calculated, deliberate, And most telling of all, executed with weapons brought to the scene, not found there. The knife wounds on Morgan McAffrey's body, according to the autopsy, revealed a targeted pattern. There was no evidence of defensive injuries on her arms, suggesting the attack was swift and from close range, likely beginning before she could fully react. The autopsy, completed on July 28th, recorded 48 separate stab wounds. 23 of them were localized to the chest and abdomen, with several penetrating vital organs. One laceration to the jugular vein, deemed non-survivable, would have resulted in fatal blood loss within minutes. There were no signs of alcohol or narcotics in Morgan's system. She was alert, sober, likely aware in the final seconds of what was happening to her. A critical element of the investigation involved mapping out the timeline preceding the murder. Investigators reviewed over 17 hours of surveillance footage from SEPTA's Meadowbrook Station, the nearby parking lot, and adjacent street cameras. At 8:12 p.m., Morgan was seen walking briskly toward the train platform. She appeared to be texting. Her phone records showed her last message was sent to a friend stating, "He said he just wants closure. I'll be quick." At 8:17 p.m., Gilbert's vehicle, a dark gray Honda Civic, pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out wearing a long-sleeve hoodie despite the warm weather. In his left pocket, a blade, tucked inside his waistband, the second knife. A minute later, the cameras lost sight of them both as they walked down the small pedestrian path toward a secluded bench between the trees, an area just outside camera range. By 8:24 p.m., a passerby heard a scream. One. Then nothing. By 8:31 p.m., Gilbert was seen walking back to his car, his hoodie zipped, his demeanor composed. He sat in the vehicle for nearly 4 minutes. Then, at 8:35 p.m., he drove off. Morgan's body was discovered at 8:38 p.m. by a man walking his dog. He called 911. The paramedics who arrived declared her deceased at the scene. The pathologist noted that based on the pooling of blood and lack of movement post-mortem, Morgan likely died within 90 seconds of the first major wound. Digital forensics confirmed additional intent. On Gilbert Newton's phone, retrieved after his arrest, investigators found search history entries including how to get someone alone without suspicion, fatal stab wound locations, and can love turn to hate overnight. The earliest of these searches dated back to July 12th, just one day after Morgan had posted a photo with her new boyfriend on Instagram. That social media post became a turning point. Gilbert had seen it. Friends later testified he reacted violently. One friend told detectives that Newton had said, "If I can't have her, no one will." Though dismissed by his circle at the time as dramatic, that comment now sat squarely within the prosecution's timeline. Morgan's friends described her as recently more alert, more cautious. She had expressed concerns about Gilbert's persistent attempts to contact her. She had even considered changing her number but hadn't yet followed through. "He's obsessive," she reportedly said to one friend. "But he wouldn't hurt me, he's just dramatic." This assumption would cost her everything. Gilbert's own digital trail revealed an escalation, from harmless nostalgia to violent ideation. Investigators reconstructed his Google searches, recovered deleted messages, and tracked GPS data showing multiple drive-bys near Morgan's workplace in the days leading up to the murder. There was no restraining order, no documented incident with police before the fatal night. The system had no warnings to act upon, but Gilbert had made his decision, and he followed through. The prosecution began building a case with layers of evidence: the forensic proof of premeditation, the digital trail indicating motive and planning, and eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene. But more importantly, they had time-stamped proof that he had arrived prepared, with weapons he concealed. There was no altercation, no heat-of-the-moment argument, no provocation. It was an ambush. One of the most sobering aspects of this case is how predictable it became, only in hindsight. The signs were there: persistent contact after a breakup, obsessive fixation, a growing sense of entitlement masked as heartache. Yet in the absence of overt threats or prior violence recorded by law enforcement, Morgan had no way to seek legal protection. It's a gap in the system that many domestic violence experts have pointed out, where warning signs exist but preventative legal tools don't. How many other cases follow this same pattern? Morgan McAffrey was 18 years old. She had just begun stepping into adulthood. A future was in front of her, cut down in 7 minutes by someone who decided her autonomy was unacceptable. That decision wasn't a snap judgment. It was an agenda, and the trail of evidence was now undeniable. The recovery of Morgan McAffrey's body was swift. The brutality of her injuries left no room for speculation. This was not a moment of passion. It was a planned execution. 43 separate stab wounds were documented across her chest, neck, and back. 27 of those penetrated vital areas, including the heart and major arteries. Defensive wounds lined her forearms, deep, erratic slashes from elbow to wrist, indicating she fought until her final breath. The scene outside Meadowbrook Station was cordoned off for 10 hours. Evidence technicians combed the brickwork for arterial spray, tracking the blood trail that began near the stairwell and extended 15 feet into the public walkway. Multiple surveillance cameras positioned around the SEPTA station captured key timestamps but no footage of the actual stabbing. The assault took place just outside the camera range, shielded by overgrown hedges. However, it was what came after the attack that proved most telling. At 8:56 a.m., approximately 6 minutes after the assault, a local resident called 911 reporting a man covered in blood heading west down the commuter trail. 4 minutes later, officers located Gilbert Newton III walking briskly along a back road in Abington Township. He was compliant, silent, and drenched in crimson. Initial questioning was brief. Newton claimed Morgan had attacked him first. He said she'd pulled a knife and that he'd defended himself. Officers immediately noted multiple inconsistencies. His clothing bore no signs of slashing, only splatter. His hands were uninjured. He had 2 knives in his backpack, both covered in blood. One had a broken handle, the other was still slick with tissue. At 9:41 a.m., Newton was booked into custody. Crime scene investigators recovered both knives, one of which matched the distinct set sold at a local Target, purchased by Newton using his debit card the night before, as shown in store CCTV. The timestamp, August 3, 2020, 9:03 p.m. The plastic bag from the purchase was found in a dumpster behind his home. Digital forensics moved quickly. Newton's phone contained no recent messages with Morgan, but his deleted folder revealed dozens of unsent texts and voice memos, some pleading, some threatening, some violent in tone. A particularly disturbing voice memo, recorded just 3 days before the murder, included him muttering, "If I can't have her, if I see her with someone else, I swear to God." Investigators presented this during the probable cause hearing as evidence of premeditation. It wasn't just the weapon purchase, it was the deliberate lure. Morgan believed they were meeting to exchange a personal item, a journal she had left at his apartment before the breakup. Newton had insisted through mutual friends that he wanted closure. Her mother later told reporters that Morgan didn't feel safe around him anymore but had agreed to the meeting because he sounded calm this time. She didn't know he had packed 2 blades. The autopsy confirmed there was no physical struggle beyond the knife wounds. No signs of sexual assault, no other trauma. Newton hadn't tried to kidnap her. He didn't try to flee. He stabbed her over 40 times, waited in the vicinity, and then walked away when the screaming stopped. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, this placed Newton in the category of reactive retaliatory offenders, those who commit lethal acts not to hide another crime, but to punish perceived betrayal. There was no evidence he intended to harm her new boyfriend. There was no attempt to dispose of the weapon. He didn't conceal his identity. He simply acted, then waited for the arrest. At no point during the interrogation did he ask whether Morgan had survived. Not once. By the time the autopsy report was finalized, the narrative around Morgan McAffrey's murder had reached a crucial inflection point. Public sentiment was boiling, but inside the investigation room, things remained clinical. The facts were prioritized over feelings, and every data point had to be verified before being logged into the case file. Morgan's body, transported from the Meadowbrook Station within the hour of discovery, had been examined by the Montgomery County Coroner's Office. The findings were sobering. She sustained 43 stab wounds, with 11 categorized as immediately fatal. The majority were to the chest and abdomen, suggesting a direct and sustained attack rather than a chaotic scuffle. Defensive wounds were prominent on her forearms and hands, consistent with a victim who had not only anticipated danger but had fought for her life. 2 knives were recovered at the scene, both carried in by Gilbert Newton III. One was a folding hunting knife with a 4.5-inch blade, heavily blood-stained, bearing a partial fingerprint belonging to Gilbert. The second, a smaller serrated kitchen blade, was located beneath the bench near Morgan's left foot. The blade snapped mid-attack. Both were entered into evidence under tags 22A and 22B, respectively. Digital evidence provided a parallel stream of confirmation. Surveillance footage from SEPTA's Meadowbrook Station, timestamped July 27, 2020 at 8:37 a.m., showed Morgan exiting her mother's car and greeting Gilbert with hesitation. No hug, no handshake, a wide berth of body language. Investigators later confirmed that Gilbert had requested this meeting under the pretense of closure, a term he had used repeatedly in texts that were now part of the forensic data pull from Morgan's iPhone. The text, extracted under warrant, provided no ambiguity. Gilbert had exhibited coercive and obsessive language laced with veiled threats. "If you won't listen to me now, you'll regret it. We started this together, and I'm not letting it end this way." Some messages were deleted by Gilbert before the crime, but digital forensic teams recovered cached versions from Morgan's iCloud backup. These became key exhibits later introduced in pretrial hearings to establish premeditation. Back at Gilbert's home, a search warrant executed within 24 hours of the murder revealed additional evidence that supported this timeline. Investigators found a handwritten note, unfinished and torn, in which he detailed how "the world doesn't understand what she took from me." Also discovered were practice stabs into a stack of old textbooks in the basement, covered in duct tape to simulate resistance. Analysts noted the blade trajectories matched the angle and depth found in Morgan's wounds. His computer history was equally damning. The browser history included searches such as "where to stab to make it quick," Pennsylvania knife laws, and "what happens if you kill in self-defense." Crucially, Gilbert had disabled his phone's GPS tracking and turned off location services on all social media platforms hours before the attack. But thanks to nearby businesses' Wi-Fi logs, investigators triangulated Gilbert's movements leading up to the crime. His phone pinged at a convenience store 2 blocks from the station, precisely 20 minutes before Morgan's arrival. He had bought a bottle of water and a pair of black latex gloves, only the former found at the scene. During interrogation, Gilbert claimed he blacked out. He stated he remembered meeting Morgan and then waking up to blood on his hands, but his behavior contradicted this claim. He had fled the scene and discarded his shirt in a public trash can, later retrieved and tested positive for Morgan's blood DNA. A passerby's dashboard camera, coincidentally parked across from that trash can, captured Gilbert removing the shirt and wiping his face with it before walking away with deliberate pace. There was no evidence of panic. What investigators found particularly disturbing was Gilbert's calculated calmness in the aftermath. He did not call 911. He did not attempt to aid Morgan. He simply walked away, later claiming confusion and trauma as his justification. But the forensic trail left behind, both digital and physical, left little room for confusion. For those examining the case, one chilling detail remained consistent. Every element of Gilbert's preparation, from his prior text threats, the selected meeting time, the disabling of digital traces, the choice of weaponry, and even the calm disposal of evidence, all pointed to a deliberate, premeditated act. The brutality of Morgan's murder was not just in the number of wounds or the location of the crime, but in the full ecosystem Gilbert built around it. False intentions, digital erasure, emotional manipulation, and calculated violence. Every piece of evidence formed a mosaic of motive and execution that, to the trained eye, revealed the intent long before the first blade was drawn. One question investigators often reflect on in such cases is not whether the murder could have been predicted, but whether it was ever truly preventable. The patterns were there, the signs were clear, but the action came too late. It's a grim reminder of how intimate partner violence can escalate rapidly when prior threats go unaddressed or dismissed. August 2021, nearly a year after the killing of 18-year-old Morgan McAffrey, the courtroom at the Montgomery County Courthouse in Pennsylvania was filled to capacity. The defendant, Gilbert Newton III, entered with a guarded expression flanked by deputies. What was about to unfold was not a trial that questioned guilt. Newton had already confessed. This was about accountability, motive, and the weight of justice. The prosecution laid out the timeline with surgical precision. On July 27, 2020, Newton lured Morgan to the Meadowbrook train station under the pretense of having a peaceful talk. He brought not one but 2 knives concealed on his person. Surveillance footage and forensic analysis confirmed what his confession already indicated. The attack was premeditated, brutal, and unrelenting. Over 40 stab wounds targeting vital areas showed intent to kill, not a momentary lapse of judgment. Digital evidence supported this. Threatening texts in the weeks leading to the murder, unanswered calls, deleted social media messages that were later recovered. All of it painted a clear picture of a young man unwilling to accept rejection and a victim who did everything right, sought distance, tried to remain safe, and yet was still cornered. Morgan's parents gave victim impact statements that were restrained but cutting. Her mother's voice did not waver when she said, "Morgan feared him. She told us he scared her, and she was right." Her father, a career paramedic, described arriving on scene after hearing the call come through, only to find out it was his own daughter on the ground. It was a detail the court would not forget. Newton's defense made a last-ditch effort to cite mental instability, referencing emotional trauma from the breakup and a lack of prior violent criminal record. But the court was not swayed. The planning, the calculated nature of the act, and the complete disregard for Morgan's autonomy made any plea for leniency a hollow gesture. The jury deliberated less than a day. Gilbert Newton III was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No appeals were granted at sentencing, no leniency extended. But beyond the legal verdict, the impact rippled wider. Morgan had been a recent high school graduate with plans to study nursing. Her friends described her as fiercely independent, funny, and insightful beyond her years. In the aftermath, her story became a rallying cry for conversations about dating violence among teenagers, an issue too often dismissed or minimized. Local schools implemented workshops on coercive control. Pennsylvania legislators reviewed language around protective orders for minors. Community organizations launched resources focused not just on physical abuse, but the subtler signs, emotional manipulation, digital stalking, verbal threats, that often precede tragedy. Morgan's name became part of that shift, not as a symbol, but as a person, a daughter, a friend, a life not forgotten. This case is a reminder that control is not love, that obsession is not devotion, that manipulation, left unchecked, festers into violence. Justice, in this case, did not bring closure, but it did bring clarity. I've told you Morgan's story not to reopen wounds, but to leave behind a warning. If you're in a relationship where fear speaks louder than love, listen. If someone's anger walks just a step behind their affection, don't ignore it. You're not dramatic. You are not overreacting. You're surviving. We need to talk more, notice more, believe more, especially when the signs are quiet. If this story made you feel something, share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Did it remind you of someone? Or maybe it changed the way you see something. And if it didn't resonate, that's okay too. Tell me why. If you're still here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories that matter waiting for you.